Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Diving into Deep Learning. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details with you. At the end of the presentation, we'll save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the toolbar on the right of your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question, simply type it in the designated box and select Send Question to Staff, and then select Send. You can do this at any time during the presentation. We will answer as many questions as we can today, and submitted questions will be consolidated, answered, and posted on apics.org in a Q&A document. Those of you viewing this program in a room with several participants, you may want to designate one person to type in the question from your group. In addition, this online event is being recorded. We will post the webinar audio and the PowerPoint slides along with the Q&A document on apics.org and in the instructor development community within a few weeks of today's live webinar. And we will email the link to everyone who is registered for this webinar. Feel free to share this link with other instructors and your APICS partner colleagues. Should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support, and those numbers are listed on this slide, at 800-263-6317 for U.S. and for international at 001-805-617-700. And now, welcome again. We're about to start the APICS webinar, Diving into Deep Learning, exploring APICS applied instructor skills, as you know it at AIS, and techniques for enhancing retention in face-to-face and online environments. This is the second in our 2018 APICS Instructor Development Series, and it discusses how to use AIS techniques in your APICS Body of Knowledge courses. Participation in this webinar and others in this series will count towards your IDP Maintenance Section 3 APICS Body of Knowledge and instructor training. That is to fulfill your 1 hour per year of relevant webinar requirements. Here are today's learning objectives. And as we advance to the next slide, we'll share our presenters. I'm very happy to introduce the presenters on today's webinar, Bob Collins, Scott Imoff, and Megan Glass. Bob is our Senior Director of Professional Development. To most of you, Bob needs no introduction, but of course we're going to introduce him anyway. In addition to his training and facilitation experience, Bob also has extensive experience as a supply chain practitioner and an ERP implementation and supply chain consulting. Bob served as APICS International President, and Bob heads the APICS Instructor Development Program. Bob will discuss the purpose of the AIS course and share some identifying applicable techniques. Megan is the APICS Learning System Product Manager at Holmes Corporation and has deep knowledge of the learning system and instructional design. She also has teaching experience at college university level. Megan will have various tools within the APICS learning system, how these tools support the AIS techniques. Like Bob, Scott Imoff is also an AIS Master Instructor of Instructor Training. Scott is currently Supply Chain Manager with GAF and has held many leadership positions within APICS at both the regional and international level. Scott will demonstrate how to apply actionable AIS strategies within CLTD Module 4. Welcome Bob, Scott, and Megan. Bob will now discuss the purpose of AIS and key instructional techniques from the course. Bob?
Thank you, Jessica. The Applied Instructor Skills, or AIS program, is designed to help our instructors engage their learners. It focuses on preparing APICS instructors to develop a student-centered learning environment and add more significant value to their learners. The AIS learning objectives include learning and applying brain-based learning and retention techniques, creating a lesson plan for a flipped classroom and/or an enhanced lesson, an opportunity to practice instructing using new techniques with your peers, and planning for the future. Hopefully you won't need a megaphone, but getting your students' attention is the first filter you must get through if they're going to learn anything. Our subconscious minds are continually scanning our environment for stimuli that grabs our attention. It could be something that the subconscious identifies as dangerous or that stirs up specific emotions. It often is something that is novel, that is new, unusual, or unexpected. We are novelty-seeking beings. As an instructor, teacher, or presenter, how do you get your students' attention? You can use their names, tell a story, use pictures, make a game of throwing a foam ball to the student willing to answer a question. Remember, the mind is drawn to novelty. So have I got your attention now? Once you have their attention, adults learn best when they understand why what you're teaching applies to them and when their emotions are engaged. Meaning is important to adult learners. We know that they are relevancy-oriented. New information must be relevant in some way to make it through this filter. Remember, everyone's favorite radio station, WIIFM, what's in it for me? Adult students want to know, why do they need to know this? How will this help them later? Think about how to answer these questions and address them before your students ask, because they will definitely need to know.
Those are some great techniques, Bob, and I just wanted to cover a couple examples here of how you can utilize those with some learning system tools. So, encouraging students to utilize those online discussion activities both before and after class can really help with that WIIFM problem you were talking about. These pre-curated prompts ask students to apply the topics for that section into their own lives. So in class, you can bring up the topics that arose in these online discussions and come up with new topics of your own that students can discuss in class. And in this way, they're constantly having the content tie back and critically think about how the content applies to them and their current situation. Another great pre-curated discussion to use is actually the Get to Know Your Classmates discussion. And this activity really gets them going right at the beginning of the program before you even step into the first classroom. The other great tool that you can use in class with your students are the learning system slides. So these slides should be viewed really as a framework to help you organize the learning system concepts and then discuss those concepts with your class. So as an instructor, you can use these to help make the content come alive for your students. Tell them something new. Use this as an opportunity to discuss some of your own stories. So after you've discussed a topic, make it relate to their company and their experiences in their lives yet again. Talk about the real world implications of the content as you're moving through the material, and don't feel hemmed in by the notes that are provided in your instructor book. These are simply there as a guide. So if students can contextualize and see the value of the content, they're going to be much more excited to learn it. So Bob, what's another key retention technique that instructors can use?
Well, Megan, emotions. Emotions are another key to retention. Emotions play a much larger role in our thinking, decision-making, and learning than we realize. Our emotions can color what we hear and see. And what we take into short-term working memory, and whether or how the information is encoded in long-term memory. We know that retention is better when a learner is in a good mood, for example, and that excessive stress can inhibit learning. So, instructor, what can you do to create an emotionally balanced learning environment?
Well, Bob, one space that can really help to create a positive classroom environment isn't necessarily even in the classroom to begin with. So the announcement tool shown here actually offers you the opportunity as an instructor to constantly encourage your students and help them feel confident through the program. This page is the first page that students see every single time they log in. So even a quick note from you every day with some note of encouragement or a benchmark for them can help them feel good about the material and foster that positive emotional environment before they even step into class the next time. So what's the next instructional technique that instructors can use, Bob?
One that I like are analogies. Analogies are a way to compare something the student already knows to something that's new to them. So for example, comparing a recipe for your favorite dish to a bill of materials and a routing. You need certain ingredients, that is components. They need to be put together in a certain way, which would be the routing, in order to make a meal that you want, which is your end item. Or how about comparing an online money management tool to keeping accurate inventory records in your ERP? Instructors who use analogies or who connect the new material to material that the student already knows increase the likelihood of encoding the new material into the student's long-term memory and improving retention.
That's great, Bob. And I know that utilizing analogies during class is a really important technique. But in addition to that, one of the new tools that the learning system has is Ask the Instructor. And often when students are writing in with questions, it's because no matter their current resources, they're still struggling with a particular item. So providing analogies in class is one space to do it, but sometimes the best place to employ this technique is helping students understand items they're still struggling with. So when students are submitting questions in the Ask the Instructor tool, you can see this as an opportunity to answer using an analogy to help make the concept a little more relatable. Now, Bob, I know you wanted to touch on some other techniques relating to flipping the classroom as well.
Yeah, flipped classes are about making the abstract real. This section is merely to discuss the instructional techniques. APICS does not mandate that you must use this technique in your course. It's just another tool in your instructor toolbox. In a traditional classroom, the student gets all of the content from the instructor who teaches it in the classroom. And then they try to practice this new material at home, taking quizzes, for example, or trying to work out problems on their own. Unfortunately, engagement and retention in this scenario are somewhat weak. In the flipped classroom, the student is responsible for their learning, think self-directed learning, which is facilitated by the instructor. The student learns the content at home before the class, and class time is used by the instructor to practice the new material, help solidify the learning through repetition, and clear up any confusion the student might have gained from their own study. In this scenario, the engagement and retention tend to be much higher. For great retention, learners need multiple contact points with the material during and after class, which may be provided through a combination of resources such as readings, practice questions, discussion boards, case studies, and instructor-selected online lectures, videos, and assignments that allow the learner to review the material at his or her own pace. And the materials remain available to the learner for homework and for exam review. Classroom time, whether face-to-face or online, is more effective when the learner has some familiarity with the material in advance of the session. The instructor's responsibility is to create an active and engaging learning environment, to curate materials, to captivate learners and hold their attention, to assess and evaluate questions and topics to guide the learners to the key concepts for each session, and to utilize a feedback loop to identify problem areas that may need extended explanations based on where your current students are in their understanding. Jose Bowen, who wrote the book Teaching Naked, which is a great book about flipped classroom design, says, Improved student learning requires clear learning outcomes, collecting data, and using a feedback loop that uses results to inform change. APICS materials do a great job articulating learning objective or outcomes, and the online learning system can help you collect the data and provide the feedback. The flipped classroom formula does not change across various classroom types. So for example, the formula works in face-to-face, blended, or any synchronous online class. One other thing I'll mention here is that research shows that quizzing is the most effective way to retain knowledge, especially if done when the student has almost forgotten the content. The quiz questions, whether they're answered correctly or not, bring the content back to mind, and it is cemented more firmly in long-term memory when it goes back in.
Those are such great points, Bob, especially about the feedback. As you can see here, it's just an example of a quiz question that students have, and it's really important that instructors are encouraging students to take these quizzes before they come into class, because as an instructor, you actually have access to the quiz reports. So you can look at your students' results and then tailor the class to areas that students are struggling in more than others. The students benefit from taking these quizzes through knowledge retention and exam practice, and it also allows them to better target their own learning and revision. So be sure to remind students that quizzes are merely a tool. They should not be used to replace the reading materials. So taking a quiz over and over again in one sitting is only going to encourage memorization and not true learning. So it's important to see these quiz tools as a space for feedback. But in addition to the quizzes, another fantastic tool for encouraging retention and engagement are activities and case studies. So although CLTD doesn't have any set case studies or activities built into the program, CSCP and CPIM do have some of these. But whether you're using the learning system activities and case studies, or whether you're creating your own and bringing them into the classroom, these types of activities create a space for experiential learning. It really puts meat on the structure of the class. So for CLTD, creating an activity can be as simple as telling students, you're starting your own company, what are the key events that you need to implement? Or make up a product, what type of material handling equipment would you need in your factory? So Scott is actually going to talk a little bit more about a sample lesson plan that he put together as an example for a CLTD class that implements these AIS techniques.
Thanks, Megan. When we look at, or before we can really start looking at the flipping activity, we want to cover a couple prerequisites that as an instructor you'd need to have in place before you could consider this tool. The first couple are hard to separate between communication and expectations. The learners need to understand what the expectation is going to be, and it needs to be communicated to them ahead of time. The importance of having that basic discovery and reading completed before the actual lesson will occur, where we do the experimentation and the activity work. Learners need to know ahead of time what material is going to be covered and are able to prepare for the class by getting the reading done ahead of time. This is always a good idea, but super important in a flipped classroom. We also need to do some planning. As an instructor, you need to make sure that the exercise is fully curated to execute smoothly. The instructor would need to have the activity fully developed. It's very difficult to just wing it if you're going to use this tool. When we look at a flipped class, you really don't need to completely flip your class, and you really don't need to start from scratch. You can flip a single element from an existing lesson plan without changing all of the other parts. Let's look at flipping just one element of a lesson. If we look at CLTD, Module 4, Section B, Topic 4, Facility Layout Decisions. Just a 40-minute section of a 4-hour lesson plan. We can flip this lesson or this component, and the rest of the legacy lesson plan can remain the same, but we'll replace the topic 4 lecture with an exercise. Looking at a little more detail of what the actual activity would be. On the right side of the page, you'll see a handout that we could have either put into our online material and sent as an announcement, or had as a physical handout to the students during the class. This exercise will give the learners an opportunity to apply the concepts that should have been covered or presented in the material from topic 4. The lesson plan is really divided into the bullet points on the left side of the page. We would divide the class into teams, probably 3 to 5 members each. Each team would then work together to answer the questions. Given about 25 minutes to collaborate as a team and work the questions at the bottom of the handout. During this time, the instructor would roam the class, spending a little bit of more intimate time with each group, confirming their progress, challenging them to dig a little bit deeper, answering any questions, and just providing general encouragement. At the end of that 25 minutes, the teams would report out on what they came up with for answers. You could either select teams, assign which team is going to answer what question, or have the teams volunteer who's ready to provide an answer for any numbered question. It's important with this type of lesson for the instructor to be very engaged during both the collaboration section and especially during the report out in order to insert comments tying the exercise back to the main concepts covered. So let's look at that in a little more detail in the wrap-up. As part of the wrap-up for the exercise, the instructor really needs to highlight those key concepts tied back to the lesson. Calling attention to correct applications in the work the learners did will help reinforce that understanding for all of the learners in the class, not just the ones that happen to capture that connection in their answer. Another thing we can do is challenge the students to revisit this exercise, applying future concepts that may be relevant to this exercise. It's crucial that the instructor inject these key concepts into the discussion throughout the wrap-up. We cannot assume that all learners will make all connections automatically. Even if this is a one-time exercise, we could challenge them on future topics to say, how could this be applied to Super Drones Incorporated, as a way to tie back that experiment activity that they did and get them to think about a new concept a little more broadly. One of the things that I like about the flipped lesson or flipping part of your lesson plan is the ability to modulate that flipped activity. We can take the same basic exercise and adjust it based on some of the things that Megan talked about. If we're gauging our learners' progress, if we can tell everybody's doing really well based on their quiz results, maybe you can dial back a lesson a little bit and use that time to apply to a concept that they're having more trouble with. I've put together a little list of things that we can use to modulate these exercises, and I'll cover them in a little more detail here. Think about the detail provided in the exercise. In the example that I showed, there was not a whole lot of detail, just a paragraph or two of background information and some pretty vague questions. You could provide more detail, and you can understand the balance between the detail provided and the detail that you would expect in the answer. You can replace detail with requiring the learners to provide the assumptions that they use to fill in the blanks where you didn't provide a lot of detail. Another thing you can do to kind of deepen the exercise is have it be more of a serial exercise. So this example is kind of a one-time thing. We're just going to talk about it, how this company applies to this concept. but maybe you revisit that same company over multiple concepts and make it kind of a serial exercise, or a build-up that with each section you cover, maybe you revisit how it would apply to that company. Another way to adjust it. Looking at scope, you could have a very narrowly defined, very specific type exercise where you're looking for a very specific or more technical answer, or it could be more broad and general, making sure they understand the overall concept. The other thing you might do is looking at the size of the groups. The dynamic in the classroom is much different if you have 15 students all working independently versus 3 groups of 5. And the amount of sharing that they do and learning from each other and reinforcing each other's understanding, you really turn all 15 learners into part of the instructor corps as they share and help each other. So the size of the group can be adjusted depending on what needs to happen. The next one is competition. Obviously, some exercises lend themselves to this approach much better than others, but some things might be just right for a competition. If the exercise has the students or the learners designing something or building something, well, who did the best? If they're making paper airplanes, which one flew the farthest? Sometimes competition will heighten the experience for some learners. Work submission is something that you can use to adjust how difficult the exercise might be. In the one we just covered, students reported out what their answers were at the end of the collaborative period. If you wanted to be a little more specific, you would provide the learners a little more time to create their answer, and maybe they have to submit a report or put together a drawing and submit that to the instructor. So the formality in how the work is reported out or turned in adds a little bit to the complexity of the exercise, as well as the time it would take. And then the last one to consider is, what are you going to use for a feedback mechanism? We've talked about the feedback and how important that is to the learning process, whether it's being used to correct an understanding or provide reinforcement for an understanding. The most straightforward and the easiest is just your basic in-class feedback. Thank you for that response, Sally. You're absolutely correct. And move on and reinforce the point. Or maybe you provide written feedback. If the work was submitted, you would have more time to evaluate it and provide a little more detail in where they could have looked a little deeper or gone a little farther, or things they may not have considered as a written feedback. And the last one to consider that really changes the game is providing or allowing for peer feedback. In using the peer feedback, you're really giving 10 of the 15 learners an opportunity to analyze a concept in addition to just learning it, and that changes the learning process a little bit more, increasing the level of understanding. So by adding that analytical element. So a lot of exercises, there's some different ways to adjust their complexity and the time they would take to make them better fit the student group that you're dealing with at that time. A couple tips just to think about as you go into flipping an element of a lesson or an entire lesson plan. The first one, and definitely the most important, is just to do it. You really need to take a dive into the pool at some point and get wet. At least try it. Be yourself. One of the traps that some instructors might fall into is trying to mimic an instructor or a presentation that they've seen that maybe they enjoyed. That's a great idea as a starting point, but you really need to make it your own to make it more meaningful, and you'll be more confident working your own material. Start small. You saw the example we walked through. not very complex and not very long. Gives you a good chance to kind of experiment with this tool. Grow and learn from that and make your next exercise even more expansive. Learn from those experiences and grow, continually improve. And lastly, adjust your exercises to fit the specific need of the specific learners that you're working with. Now I'll pass it back to Jessica to help with some questions.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Bob and Megan. We've saved some time for Q&A, and we'll give you a few moments to send in your questions. We have one question. It came out of Megan's section, actually. Do we have to post announcements every day?
Thanks, Jessica. No, absolutely not. You don't have to. There's no requirement there. But it is important to remember that the announcements page is the first page that students are going to see every time they log in. So having something fresh up there is helpful for the students. But also, there's tools built into the announcements themselves that can help you as an instructor. And one of those is the fact that you can preload announcements as drafts. So you can have a bunch of kind of stock announcements that you've built up as you've run your classes, saved off in a Word document somewhere else, and then you can preload those into any new class that you have and then publish them as you need to. So there have been some instructors who kind of preload different video links that they may or may not share with the class, just depending on which topics that particular class needs more or less help with. Quick and easy kind of benchmark messages and things like that can also easily be stored in the announcements as drafts as well.
Thanks, Megan. One question that we have is the ability of, can we get a copy of your super drones exercise?
It's up to Scott.
Scott?
Certainly, I can send that in. We can put it with a full-size one with the rest of the material.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you.
So Jessica, that actually reminds me of a really great library that you guys have on the IDP where instructors, I think, can share some of those tools. Is that right?
That's correct. Actually, Scott, you can post this into the IDP library. We have a section in there for different lesson plans and tools. So you can go ahead and post it. Thanks for the reminder, Megan. And IDP instructors have access to that library. Another question, and this is a question for Scott and Bob. How do you get students to read ahead in advance and come prepared?
I can start with that one. One of the things I think as an instructor you need to do is kind of just lay the foundation with the expectation and share that with the students that is the expectation. Make sure they understand they're only going to get out of the course what they're really putting into it. And, try to create some metric where you are pacing them with how much they're doing. But I think the main thing is just to create the expectation that they keep up with the reading and try to test that on a weekly basis so that they understand if they're not getting the reading done, they are missing out on some of the class discussion.
That's really a good answer, Scott, and I'd certainly agree. A lot of it starts with instructor expectations. I've heard some constructors complain about this. I certainly understand. The students that they're teaching are busy people. But I know other instructors who teach very similar learners who don't seem to have a problem with this. Their learners do read ahead, do their quizzes, come prepared. One of the expectations that the instructor needs to set, and it's something that we talk about here when we do webinars or talk about, preparing for the exams online. Students who are most successful in the exams typically spend 100+ hours preparing for the exam. Now, if your class is 32, 40 hours long, that still leaves another 60, 68 hours that they need to do the work. And if they're doing it along the way, they're more likely to be successful than if they just go to class and don't do any of the other work. And as we also mentioned earlier, another good reason to continually encourage your students to read and do the quizzes is because you as an instructor are able to see the results of those, and it can help guide you in areas where your class may be strong or weak, and you can guide, that will guide your discussion and teaching in those classes as well to add more value to the students.
Thanks, Bob. And we have a question from Nicolas in France. And I think it can go out to everybody. How do you evaluate students during the flipped class? Do you evaluate their preparation and how they conduct and respond to the answers during class?
I can start with that one. I think absolutely, as part of curating that exercise, you'd want to have some ideas of what success looks like. So was it how well they understood the concept and how well they were able to demonstrate that understanding in their answers, how complete their answers were, and even digging into some of the technical aspects. The more detail you put in the exercise, the more precise the answers should be. Might be one of the things that you could gauge. And again, if you want to look at adjusting the complexity of the exercise, you could have the peers in the group evaluate everybody's answer, whether publicly or by a poll after the class, you know, which group had the best answers. But I think the main thing is just providing the feedback to the learners if they are understanding or demonstrating their understanding of the concept thoroughly.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer as well, Scott. Having those predetermined outcomes really make the biggest difference as to know how well your students are responding to the exercises and what they're actually learning. So that's great. Thank you.
Megan, we have a question for you here. It's coming from Michael Callahan, I believe, in Ireland. Glad to hear that we have access to the Super Drone CLTD exercise. The question is, what is the time frame for adding learning activities and videos to the CLTD learning system?
That's actually more of a question for Bob. Bob and I work together on the products, and while I help with actually implementing a lot of those changes, the direction actually comes from Bob and the professional development team over there. So, Bob, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, it's certainly our intention to continue to add more exercises, case studies, and videos to all the courseware. The real constraint, to be honest, and I'm sure nobody will believe this, is money. Videos are not inexpensive to create and prepare. We now have, well, it's better than it was before, but we now have 4 exams with courseware that has to be reviewed each year, and you know, making all that work as well is a little more complex. But as we go forward, and we're all family here, you know that we have to create a budget. The budget has to be approved by the board, and I know the board would love us to have more exercises as well. You know, we'll continue to work on the budgeting of that and continue to add material as we're able.
Thank you, Bob. That's all the time that we have today for questions. What we'll do is consolidate all the questions received today and then answer them in a question and answer document that we'll post with this webinar on apics.org and in the Instructor Development Community Library. You'll receive an email with a link. Feel free to share this link with the other IDP instructors your APICS partners and chapter leaders. And now, before we close, I just wanted to share links for additional resources that our IDP instructors may find useful, and following some of the items that are discussed in today's webinar. All active IDP instructors should have access to the IDP Distance Learning Center through My APICS, and the APICS Body of Knowledge Video Index, so videos that you may want to use in your classes, as Bob and Scott spoke to. It's available at apics.org/instructor development IDP maintenance. And finally, mark your calendars for these upcoming webinars in the 2018 series, the 21st of August and the 20th of November. And we want to thank you all for attending today and for sending us your questions and comments. Have a great day. We hope you will all attend the next webinar, August 21st. And all content and materials included in this online event are the property of APICS and are protected by the U.S. International Copyright Law. All rights are reserved. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.